This is discussion 3A, the first part of discussion 3 for History 111. I've talked about a number of civilizations here already. We talked about ancient Mesopotamia, and we talked about Egypt, and we've talked about Harappan civilization now. In each of those three civilizations had used irrigation extensively, either to manage flooding or to manage dry environments, etc. We're going to see some other civilizations that also do that. I'm going to talk about China for the next lecture, and in particular northern China does that, and I'm going to talk about the Maya in future lectures. And so all of these civilizations are what's called hydraulic societies. And what that means is, hydraulic comes from the word hydro for water, and what it means is that they have to manage water. They either have too much water or too little water, or too much water at some times and too little other times. But whatever the case, they need to do massive irrigation projects, dams, levees, irrigation canals, ditches, etc., to manage water. All right. Now, one interesting theory in history was put together by a guy named Carl August Wittfogel in the early 20th century, and Wittfogel he looked at a lot of ancient civilizations, and he argued that in fact being a hydraulic society has a lot of influences and impacts on the type of society you become. That the very fact that your society is built on irrigation and water management has all sorts of knock-on effects that come along. Now, Wittfogel himself was trying to argue that Asian societies were all hydraulic societies, and that because of this, you can say things about Asian people that it was racist and it was stupid. But there's a core of truth to Wittfogel's thesis that being a hydraulic society shapes other parts of your civilization. So I want to talk about Wittfogel's thesis. He said, if you look at a hydraulic society, he says you'll find several things. First of all, being a hydraulic society in the first place requires organization, because you have to, it's not, each individual farmer cannot do irrigation ditches, right? If you're going to have massive dams and earthworks, you're going to try to capture massive floodwaters, you need to have lots of people working together. So it requires organization. Everyone has to agree they're going to put in a certain amount of work on irrigation systems, and that requires a certain amount of centralization. Somebody has to be planning the irrigation systems, somebody has to be making sure they're maintained, somebody has to be checking them to make sure they're not going to fail, and somebody has to basically oversee the entire system for it to work, which requires a society with a certain amount of coordination, a certain amount of organization. Well, Wittfogel argues that that implies a strong government, right? That it requires that you have a government that represents everybody and can tell people what to do and can force people to work if they don't want to work, so that the whole thing works as a system. And so a centralized government is able to make sure everybody contributes to maintaining the irrigation system so that it works for everybody. But that means you need a strong centralized government. It also implies cities, that when you have a really strong centralized government that's collecting taxes and forcing people to work, you're often going to have a pretty big organization in the government. You're going to have a lot of class stratification. And so Wittfogel argues you're going to have big cities, you're going to have strong government, etc. And if you want to make all that work, you need a certain level of bureaucracy. You need a bunch of people working in the government who are keeping records, who are calculating, doing engineering and calculating water volumes, etc. You need people to keep track of how much water comes through every year, and when the flooding starts and when the flooding stops, and all those sorts of things. And that requires a certain amount of science, right? That you have to actually systematically collect data so that you can predict in the future when the flooding is going to start, or when it's going to end, or how high the waters are going to get, etc. And overall, this requires then a sort of systematic knowledge. You have to be systematic about collecting knowledge. You have to be systematic about organizing the knowledge. You have to be systematic about storing the knowledge and being able to access it again. You have to have good writing systems, good filing systems. You have to have a lot of expertise at handling a lot of knowledge. Right? And so Wittfogel argues that in basically, if you want to look at some of the civilizations we've looked at so far, like Africa and the Bantu civilizations, they did not develop centralized governments. They did not develop big cities, etc. early on. And Wittfogel would argue that part of the reason for that is that their agriculture was not dependent on irrigation. They basically got dependent on rainfall. And they got good amounts of rainfall spread out throughout the year at the right times so that they could just do agriculture dependent on rainfall. They didn't need irrigation. And you could make and Wittfogel would make a similar argument for Europe, that we'll see that later Europe does not develop centralized, early on does not develop big centralized empires in places where it gets enough rainfall. So Northern Europe does not develop big centralized empires. So overall, Wittfogel has this theory about ancient civilizations, which is that if they have to manage water to survive, if they have to do irrigation to survive, you're going to get a very strong centralized government. You're probably going to get a monarchy. He would say it was a despotic government and not a democratic government, but an authoritarian government where one king made all the decisions and could force everyone else to do things. You're going to have a strong military. You're going to have big cities. You're going to have a bureaucracy of clerks and people keeping data. You're going to have science, and you're going to have systematic knowledge. That's a theory. And of course, if you look through history, you're going to be able to find exceptions to that. You're going to be able to find societies that are like this that aren't hydraulic, and you're going to be able to find some societies that are hydraulic that aren't like this. But as a general theory, it fits pretty well with the ancient world. That if we look at the places we develop a really strong centralized government, often these are places, in fact almost always, these are places that have a hydraulic society that has to manage a lot of water. And so it seems to be that the requirements of a hydraulic society lead to strong centralized government, lead to big cities, lead to bureaucracy, science, systematic knowledge, etc. Or at the very least, it strongly pushes a society in that direction. So this is the Wittfogel's thesis. In the second part of the discussions for today, I'm going to look at some of the impacts of agriculture and hydraulic societies on the environment. And I'm going to in particular look at two what are probably environmental disasters that happened as a result of hydraulic societies mismanaging their environment.